Hello and welcome to Insights with me, Lynn O'Donnell. I'm joined by Ahmad Shuja, a lawyer living in Australia. He's an academic, a former official in the former government of Afghanistan, an advocate for human rights, an author and a Hazara. His first book is called The Decline and Fall of the Republic of Afghanistan, which he co-authored with Australian academic William Maley and which came out within a year of the events of August 2021, documenting the corruption and ineptitude of the governments of former Presidents Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani. We're talking on the third anniversary, if that's the right word, of the collapse of the Republic, about what happened and why, and what comes next. Have a listen. Hi Shuja, thank you for joining me. I've done a very short introduction, but I think you've done and achieved so much that I'm really just scratching the surface. Can you start, please, by introducing yourself?
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for having me on the show today. My most recent qualification is that I am now a lawyer admitted to practice in Australia. But before that, I was a civil servant in the Office of the National Security Council of Afghanistan. And before that, I worked in various capacities, including with Human Rights Watch, doing research and advocacy on human rights related issues.
Right. And as you say, you worked in the Office of the National Security Advisor. You were Director General for International Relations and Regional Cooperation. So you have an insider's view of the collapse of the Afghan Republic. In your view, and also with 3 years hindsight, what were the fundamental reasons for the failure of the Republic?
You don't ask any of the easy questions, Lynn, do you? I think there's to answer that question, my co-author for the book, William Maley, and I, we wrote a whole book about that. And as you can imagine, a question like that for a country like Afghanistan has no simple or easy answers. And anybody who tells you otherwise is dissembling. But I think but you can point to fundamental sort of factors that resulted in not just the decline, but also the fall of the Republic of Afghanistan. And in our view, there are dozens of countries in the world that are in a position of decline that have similar problems like Afghanistan had, which is poverty, which is sort of multi-partisan contentious politics, security challenges, ethnic cleavages, geographic limitations like Afghanistan had because it lacked access to global markets through a warm seaport. Many countries have these kinds of issues, and a lot of them are in decline. And many of these countries remain in a state of decline for years and decades and generations, but often you don't see these countries collapsing the way we saw it in Afghanistan. And we sort of try to, as we try to sort of analyze what factors led to the collapse, I think we look at this phenomenon called the cascade issue, which is that there is one event that sets into motion a series of other events that result in dramatic changes in the situation. In our view, even though the factors of decline, which were issues of constitutional design, flaws in leadership, were on the one side, they contributed to a decline of Afghanistan. But the factor that resulted in the cascade of events that ultimately led to the fall of Afghanistan, you could point to a significant factor, which was the start of negotiation between Zalmay Khalilzad, the American Special Envoy for Afghanistan Peace, and the Taliban. Now, these negotiations didn't come out of the blue. The negotiations, when they started, everybody was, not everybody, there was significant optimism that they would lead to something. But the optimism, in our view, was misplaced because the Taliban didn't come to the negotiating table because they had come down from their initial positions. They came to the negotiating table because the United States had actually come down from their position. Because if you look at the history of American attempts to negotiate with the Taliban, They were included under Richard Holbrooke, the successor in a similar portfolio to Zalmay Khalilzad and Secretary of State Clinton. The point was that if the Taliban were to negotiate, and the US wanted to negotiate with the Taliban, they had to accept the constitution of Afghanistan, they had to accept the human rights gains, women's rights gains in Afghanistan, and they had to negotiate with the Afghan government first. When Zalmay Khalilzad came to occupy his position, the US dropped all of those positions. Yeah. And so all of a sudden, the Taliban had an opening in which they could directly negotiate with the United States to the exclusion of the Afghan government. Now, when this happened, it created a sense of inevitability, in the sense of now that the United States is negotiating with the Taliban, and now that the Taliban have finally started to break the ice and talk about peace, that it's inevitable that they will come back in some form or another. And so when that changes, it changes the fundamentals of everything. It changes the fundamentals of politics, because if you remember, it actually put into significant doubt whether the 2019 presidential elections will go forward, because people thought, well, if peace is going to come, why would you do elections? And that put into question a fundamental constitutional requirement in the Afghan Republic. And politicians started hedging. They started establishing relationships. The region started hedging, because even countries that had hitherto been reluctant to meet with the Taliban, such as India, they started meeting with India, and that changed. It also changed the fundamentals for the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, who were out there putting their lives in danger every single day, because the U.S. Taliban deal had resulted in a situation in which the Americans were taken out of the equation, and so the Taliban could now hit the Afghan security forces without many repercussions.
But it was also pretty obvious, wasn't it, that the Trump administration just wanted to leave. This was Trump's platform, was to get out of what he called what were called the forever wars. So the Taliban went into those discussions with Trump's representative, Zalmay Khalilzad, knowing that Trump wanted to leave.
It's a fair question, and that's the big argument that Zalmay Khalilzad and others who were sort of policy evangelists of his approach had, which is that, look, Trump is going to leave anyway. The U.S. may as well negotiate some terms for its withdrawal. But the problem with that was that the U.S. only negotiated certain very minimal terms for its own withdrawal and no peace. Because if you remember, the Doha Agreement and Zalmay Khalilzad's terminology about the Doha Agreement was that it would result in inter-Afghan negotiations that would result into permanent ceasefire. Yeah. Now, a ceasefire is not peace, because a ceasefire means that the Taliban maintain their ability to make violence. They're just ceasing fire against the Afghan state and the people and the constitution and the rights. But the other fundamental question that I recall the Afghan government bringing up with our US allies was, fine, if you're leaving, by all means, we are not going to ask you to continue to stay, but why don't you negotiate with us the modalities of your withdrawal, as opposed to keeping us out of the room and negotiating with the Taliban, because that changes the fundamentals for the Afghan government and the Afghan state. And the Americans, to my knowledge, never quite answered that question.
Yes, and haven't yet, and probably won't. How do you see the situation in the country now? We're talking around the third anniversary of the collapse on the 15th of August, 2021. What's your assessment?
Look, we've all seen the situation of women. We've all seen the situation of ethnic minorities like the Hazaras, the situation of groups and ethnic groups like the Panjshiris who are putting up an armed resistance. We've all seen the situation of the Uzbeks and the Turkmens in the north who are being evicted from their lands. All of that is a tragedy. I think that tragedy is happening within a broader political landscape in which the relationship of the person, the Afghan citizen, and the state, which was citizen constitution, has been upended. And now the relationship is Amir, who is an unappointed occult figure ruling by decree, and subject, who is expected to have obedience to the Amir. And so that fundamentally changes the relationship between the citizen and the Afghan state. And so that allows the Taliban regime to continue to perpetrate the kinds of human rights violations and mass atrocities that we've seen them do over the past 3 years, unfortunately. And although you're beginning to see that the Taliban actually are sort of getting more comfortable in using the levers of power, because if you remember, Taliban 1.0 in the 1990s came to power in a country that didn't have the fundamentals of a state. There was no taxation mechanism. There was no army corps. There were no ministries. There was no bureaucracy with its IT system and a trained workforce. Now they've actually come and imposed themselves by force over instruments of state that they're using to coercively control the Afghan population. The media has been now silenced. I have a lot of respect for the journalists who continue to get up every morning and do their job, but they're doing their job under severe restraints and at great personal risk. The women have been kept away almost entirely from civil society. Groups like the Hazaras have been purged, not just from the bureaucracy, but they don't have any representation in the Taliban's, say, General Director of Intelligence, which is leading Taliban's domestic policy. And so therefore, they're unable to articulate their political interests. And they're living under the yoke of a regime that has historically committed mass atrocities directly based on their ethnic religious identity. And you have former Afghan National Defense and Security Force members who are being taken in, tortured, and often killed. So the situation, unfortunately, is one in which the Taliban are able to feel more comfortable in using the instruments of state, which they have inherited, which they haven't deserved, that they have imposed on themselves, in order to coercively control and perpetrate mass atrocities in Afghanistan.
And nevertheless, Afghanistan seems to have disappeared completely from global consciousness. I mean, there is a lot going on, Ukraine, Middle East, terrorism on the rise in Africa, cost of living crisis, all the things that are going on, and the American election coming up. But nevertheless, there are awful things, as you say, being perpetrated by the Taliban in Afghanistan. And what happens in Afghanistan, as we know, definitely does not stay in Afghanistan. The human rights situation, as you say, is particularly awful. Why do you think it's just disappeared from public consciousness? And what do you think are the likely knock-on or ripple effects of ignoring what's going on in Afghanistan and letting it continue?
Yeah, look, the outgoing President Biden has long just wanted to just wash his hands off Afghanistan and focus on this big, grand strategy issue of the clash of democracy versus authoritarian America versus China. So that's his focus. And he has a massive power of agenda setting. And the world theater is affording him the ability to actually make that argument with what's happening in Ukraine with Russia and what's happening in other parts of the world, where there does seem to be this apparent clash of democracy versus non-democracy. And so not only is there a lot going on in the world, which is keeping America and the rest of the world busy, but there's also a lot that it has to be said about the current American administration's willingness to just wash his hands off. Because if the US is not promoting the issue of Afghanistan and the egregious human rights violations, most other countries usually do not talk about it, which means that if you have, as a foreign country, taken out your diplomatic staff in Afghanistan, and you have you don't have an ally that is encouraging you to continue to talk and act about an issue, then there seems to be a vacuum there. But that's just one factor. The other factor is that you typically have in global civil society organizations, for example, women's rights groups, minorities' rights groups, typically very active in situations where you see egregious rights violations like this in Afghanistan. And what I don't fully understand is why are these organizations sort of less active than you would imagine given the scale of the atrocities in Afghanistan. But while that is happening, while the Taliban have silenced domestic media and have allowed only limited expression in the media, which means that we don't really see the scale of their atrocities. International media is severely limited, and the UN has only a political mission, UNAMA, which is political by nature. So a lot is happening inside of Afghanistan that we don't know. Some of it is happening that we do. And what we do know is that there are very large numbers of people from Afghanistan immigrating to regional countries and to the West. And so Europe has long been concerned about the issue of the human flow from Afghanistan to its borders. So that's one phenomenon that's happening. And this is a phenomenon of people who are being forced out of their country. The other thing that we know is as a result of American military action, which is they have actually killed Al-Qaeda's #1 leader in the safe house hosted by a most wanted terrorist, the Haqqanis. And so these organizations, global terrorist organizations, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and dozens of others from regional countries, Central Asia, are in Afghanistan, either on the margins of the Taliban territory or under their direct auspices, as we saw with Al-Qaeda, and they're actively plotting and they're actively doing things not just to harm the interests of the far West. We saw what ISIS Afghanistan, based in Afghanistan, did to Russia, but also in the regional countries. And so things are happening, and things are happening under Taliban-controlled Afghanistan that is a direct source of threat to the region, but also the broader world, which is Europe and Moscow and other places. And some of it is happening as a result of the human flow, as a result of Taliban's atrocities in Afghanistan.
But you also have Taliban leaders going to Tehran, for instance, to meet with Hamas leaders. So the lie, part of the lie that there was an attempt to perpetrate around the collapse of the republic, that the Taliban is a nationalistic organization focused only on Afghanistan, has also been blown when you have the Taliban offering to send boots, if you like, or militant active gunmen to help Hamas in the Middle East. The transnational nature of the organization has also been exposed. But I'm also curious about your view. You've been very much involved in the past in human rights advocacy. As you said, you worked for Human Rights Watch as a researcher in Afghanistan for some years, and that's when we met. The human rights element, it also has ripple effects. When you don't hear, as you said, minorities advocacy groups, women's advocacy groups outside of the country raising their voices or having their voices heard about what's going on in Afghanistan, you also create, do you not, the possibility that what is happening to women there also starts to happen to women elsewhere. I mean, I saw something on Twitter within the last few hours about Donald Trump saying, "What's wrong with the veil? Better than makeup, easier. I like it." You know, and the reproductive autonomy of American women is also being politicized, and what happens in America very quickly spreads to the rest of the Western world. And I wonder whether you have a view on the ripple effects of what's happening to people generally, women specifically, minorities specifically in Afghanistan when it comes to tolerance for that level and that sort of repression elsewhere.
I think you're asking a key fundamental question here, Lynn. And to go back to what you alluded to in terms of Taliban-Hamas relations, one of the first groups that actually congratulated and celebrated the Taliban's violent return to power in Afghanistan was Hamas.
Hamas was three. Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and Imran Khan, who was at that time the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Go on.
So what you're alluding to, Lynn, is a really important question, because one of the first organizations that congratulated the Taliban on their return to power, violent return to power in 2021, was Hamas. It was also Al-Qaeda and the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, who was a big Taliban booster and supporter, and he's no longer in power. Now, that says something. Beyond the fact that the Taliban has these sympathizers and supporting organizations abroad, it also says something else, because after the 15th of August of 2021, we saw people on Twitter celebrating and tweeting at me insulting messages for being a former official of the former government in places that you wouldn't have even imagined would have anything to do with the Taliban, which is Bangladeshi people, accounts purportedly based out of Bangladesh were congratulating the Taliban, Somalia were congratulating the Taliban, Pakistan, even some accounts based out of India were congratulating the Taliban. And so the Taliban's model of using terrorism and violence to dethrone and to overthrow a democratically elected constitutional system, to impose by force a fundamentalist Islamist regime, is a proof of concept for millions of citizens around the world. It is an inspiration for many groups like Hamas and Al-Qaeda. And so one reason why the Taliban's idea is not going to stay confined within the bounds of Afghanistan is because it is such a powerful concept. It is such a powerful proof of concept. The other reason is that the egregious violations of human rights that the Taliban are perpetrating in Afghanistan, and despite all of that, they're receiving ambassadors from countries of the world, China, Iran, Pakistan, Azerbaijan, and they're able to send diplomats around outside to these countries, is that you can actually violate with impunity fundamental human rights treaties that the ICCPR, the Civil Political International Convention on Civil Political Rights, the ICESR, Social and Economic Rights. These are the fundamental treaties that determine some of the very basic rights of every person in the world. Yeah. So when a regime in control of a state can violate these two basic conventions, and the world does not say a thing, or even does a half-hearted condemnation every once in a while, or they don't even do that. They actually send ambassadors to that regime and receives diplomats from that regime. They're contributing towards the erosion of the international norms, international rights of the human person, of the global citizen, wherever they are. Yeah. Because if another regime in another part of the world can come to power similar to the Taliban, and they can point to, and the world tells them to respect human rights, they can easily point to, look at what the Taliban are doing. You're not saying a thing to them. Yeah. Similar to what they're saying with some other countries, and we don't need to name them because they're close allies of a certain superpower. So unfortunately, it is a norm setting. There's a norm setting going on here. One norm setting is that it's an inspiration proof of concept to the Taliban, their like-minded allies and individuals around the world who share their ideology. But on the other hand, it's also sort of contributing to the erosion of the global human rights norms that will be a threat, frankly, to every citizen everywhere, if not today, but ultimately at some point.
Well, today I would argue that it is immediate, and that we've had 3 years of it. When you normalise atrocity and abuses in the way that that normalization has been going on for the past 3 years, it becomes normal for everybody, and our standards and our expectations are lowered accordingly. I think that's where we've been going for the past 3 years. But there has been, as we know, a great effort amongst people, Afghan people outside and their supporters, to change the narrative, no matter how successful or otherwise it's been. But a lot of it has been jargonized. And I'd like to talk to you about that, because we've had a conversation about the power of jargon or otherwise. And I wonder whether what has become jargon, does it help? Does it affect the meaning of the words? Is there a loss in translation of the impact of words like genocide and apartheid, especially when it's applied to gender apartheid? Does this help or hinder, do you think, when it comes to raising awareness or encouraging action? What do you think?
It's a very complex question, Lynn. But I think you're asking the right question. It's an important question because we need to have a conversation around this. Number one, I have been part of protests and events that have decried what you call the jargonized term of gender apartheid. I have been a part of groups organizing protests against what we claim, what we think, and know is acts of genocide against the Hazara people.
Mm.
Now, on there is no doubt about the sincerity and the deeply felt nature of the people who are using these terms of gender apartheid. People are sincere when they say that. Sincere when they say that there are acts of genocide against the Hazara people going on in Afghanistan. So there's no doubt about the sincerity of that. Now, what is happening here is multi-level. Number one, it is much harder to say, look at what is happening to the women of Afghanistan. They're not allowed to go out of their home. They're not allowed to go to university. They're not allowed to hold a job. They're not even allowed to be women doctors. It's very hard to make that case. If you were to use a hashtag, so to speak, in your activism, you will use a term that is broadly representative. And so this is an attempt by the activists in Afghanistan and their international allies, for example, to use a term that they think is broadly representative of what is going on, even though it does not in every context completely convey the nuances of what is happening. Mm. So that's one issue. And you see this happen in other parts of the world as well. For example, the Black Lives Matter is not just about Black lives, it's about a whole system of oppression that the protesters are talking about, a history behind that people are talking about, but it has come down to one particular expression. The Me Too movement, for example, is talking about a system of patriarchy that is more complex, but it has been reduced to a particular expression that is sort of symbolic of everything else. The other thing, let's come to talk about genocide. Now, the thing about the Genocide Convention is that it is supposed to be preventative, which means the convention is talking about a situation in which acts are being contemplated or being carried out that don't have to result in the death of a single person of a social group for those acts to constitute acts of genocide. So there is no threshold of if a certain percentage of people of a particular group die, it's a genocide, or if a certain number die, it's a genocide, because the convention is preventative and the convention is not prescriptive like that. Because as soon as you put a percentage, it becomes the ceiling and people try to, it becomes a mess. Now, having said that, genocide is one of the most egregious human rights violations imaginable under international law, which is why it is the responsibility of all states to take action against it. And that's why it becomes a political issue that when a group like the Hazaras are raising the issue of genocide, most countries of the world do not pay attention. They look the other way. They pretend that they haven't heard it. They ask questions about, oh, genocide is a big deal, because they don't want to be saddled with the burden of taking action against an issue like that. And similar with gender apartheid is that the global community, unfortunately, is not listening intently enough, because that entails a responsibility. And it's not that it's an easy thing. It's an easy situation for. So to put that to one side, there is a certain point in which a third person observer looking at these terms would raise a question along the lines that you have, and I think there is this, and I think that is legitimate. But I also think that there is no doubt about the sincerity of the women activists who are raising that question and their allies. There's no doubt about the Hazara activists who are raising alarms about genocide. But the truth is that for activism and for your cause to receive international attention, you have to use certain broad terms to convey bigger structural meaning. But does throwing around big terms like genocide and apartheid contribute towards a dilution of certain meaning? I think we can have an epistemological question around that. And I think that's a separate question.
Indeed, but what you need to do, in my view anyway, what needs to be done is to get a broader support so that people, ordinary people, people out there on the street understand and are outraged in the same way that, if I may say, Hamas's PR has been quite world-beating in many ways. Why isn't it that half of the world's population is not enraged about what is happening to women in Afghanistan? Because next it could be me next. And so I'm concerned about whether or not it is the use of jargon that just makes people roll their eyes and move away. And should there not be perhaps a more effective approach in making people aware that it is an everyday, like the Australian Cricket Authorities, for instance, Cricket Australia is the only sporting body in the world that I know of that has decided unilaterally that it will not have bilateral contact with the Afghan cricket team, which is the Taliban's cricket team, in my view, until women are allowed to play sport again, because part of Cricket Australia's agenda is the encouragement and support of women in cricket. That no longer happens in Afghanistan. And so when you're talking to people about something like cricket that they can identify with and understand, and maybe their own daughters play, or they'd like them to, or the girls next door do, or there's a girls' cricket team at school, through that they can understand what the implications are of what's happening to girls and women in Afghanistan, rather than with the use of hashtags, like you say, Black Lives Matter, nuggets a huge institutionalized systemic wrong to a broad swathe of people that is lost in those three words, if people want them to be lost, or in gender apartheid, which is, it's almost like an academic jargonization of the issue. Is that where it's going wrong?
I think you're right about that. I think you're right to raise that question, because the other thing that I can remember is this campaign of defund the police.
Yeah.
Now, it speaks about the campaign. I think had raised legitimate questions about police brutality, about the disproportionate effects of police brutality on certain racial and minority groups in the United States. But this whole idea of defund the police was a terminology that reasonable people afraid of leaving their doors unlocked at night because they live in very difficult neighborhoods felt an aversion to it, even though they supported the idea of actually reducing police brutality. So hashtags like that or catchphrases like that can have an adverse negative repercussion for the sort of neutral third person observer. So you're right to raise that question. The other way to look at it is that the people of Afghanistan, the women of Afghanistan, have been talking about the issue of we can't go to school, we can't go to university, we're not allowed to even be female doctors, we're not allowed to sit in the same classroom, but nobody seemed to pay attention. And so they have actually started lobbying for the use of this term gender apartheid.
Yeah.
And that lobbying has now resulted in this other campaign, which is recognize or codify gender apartheid as a crime against humanity. And so this is sort of in my view, the way I have observed it is that it's sort of an evolution of that advocacy, which is look at what is happening. They gave everyday examples and the world just didn't pay enough attention. And they then coalesced around this particular issue. I think one thing that we could potentially, that the women of Afghanistan learn is what I think Iranian women have done with respect to the campaign about not being allowed to sit in sporting stadiums to attend soccer games. I think we're beginning to see that women from Afghanistan and activists from Iran are making common cause, that they're learning and exchanging lessons. There is value to that, and there's value in the sense that they're creating alliances and learning lessons and amplifying each other's messages. So I think some of that lesson learning is happening that you're talking about. But I agree with you that the most important and the most effective way is to use individual stories and to use individual examples of what gender apartheid really means in the life of a girl who's trying to have a life, an ordinary life in Afghanistan, to have to take advantage of ordinary human rights in Afghanistan, but cannot.
Yeah, indeed. You mentioned the codification of gender apartheid. Would you mind explaining what that means and how it could make a difference to the situation that prevails?
I think there's a movement afoot at the moment which is asking the Sixth Committee of the UN Human Rights Council, I believe, or Commission. I mix the two because they've evolved. The name has changed in recent years. For them, to the Sixth Committee, to recognize and put into international human rights treaties this idea of adding in the list of crimes against humanity gender apartheid. And so what that means is that what the activists are hoping to achieve by that is if you put it on the books that gender apartheid is a crime against humanity, then by definition, what is happening in Afghanistan in terms of gender apartheid is a crime against humanity. And what that does is it entails certain international responsibility by the international community to take action.
Okay. Thank you for that. It is complex, and a lot of people, like I said, are just it's an eye roll for a lot of people. It's too difficult. So the contextualization, I think, and the impact of that is important to understand. In conversations between the two of us that we've had, you've called this period of time that we're in the post-US era for Afghanistan, by which we're talking the last 3 years, or the first 3 years of the post-America era for Afghanistan. What's the legacy or legacies of the 20 years of Western-supported republicanism likely to be?
The legacy in the long term will be determined by what America does next in Afghanistan, which is in the past 20 years, the US invested in universities, in healthcare, in education, in bringing Afghanistan out of in extreme isolation and extreme desolation. Afghanistan was a pile of rubble in the 1990s under the Taliban regime, and there was tremendous investment in building roads, enabling markets, creating an economy, and that resulted in reduced infant mortality, reduced maternal mortality, increased life expectancy, increases in the participation of women in public life, including in parliament. There was a point in which the 28% representation, women representation in the Afghan parliament was more than the US Congress. So all of that is likely to have a generational impact. And so you have educated millions of people in Afghanistan, men and women. You have enabled millions of people in Afghanistan, men and women, to be journalists, to be entrepreneurs. And so that effect is going to be enduring, and it's going to be long-term inside of Afghanistan and outside of Afghanistan. But that effect is going to be enduring in only a limited way because it's a generational effect. The generation after those people are now being forced to live and grow up under the Taliban. And that generation has none of those freedoms, has none of those opportunities, and have all of the encumbrances that it comes with living under the cruel yoke of the Taliban. And so there's a glowing, I think, very positive legacy of the United States in Afghanistan, but that legacy is threatened by the Taliban's continued presence. What will the legacy be in 20 years hence? I think depends on what the American government will do with this current with the current Taliban regime in power in Afghanistan. If the next president, whoever it is able to speak for the rights of the people of Afghanistan, is able to support and normalize the idea that women in Afghanistan should be able to go to school, that minorities should not face mass atrocities, and that ANDSF members, former members, should not be taken away from their homes in the dead of the night and their bodies showing up in the local stream, then what that means is that these are tangible steps that the international community are taking to protect those gains and to actually protect and normalize norms of international behavior under the treaties that we talked about. Unless the US does that, I think in 20 years hence, the US legacy is going to be one of an ally who abandoned an ally at a critical time. And that abandonment amounted to a betrayal, not just of that state and of that political group in power, but also of the thousands and millions of people in Afghanistan who cast their lot in with democracy, with freedom, with the values that they shared with the United States. But then when the time came, the United States failed to show up and help them defend those freedoms and those values.
Well, indeed. You said that, you went through the roll call really of all of the gains. It's, excuse me, it's not unusual to meet people. I'm in London. I travel quite a bit, as you do as well. It's not unusual to meet people who think that there was absolutely no gain at all. What a waste of time, money, lives, etc. It was. With and that message that there was education, media, health, life expectancy, that there were infrastructure, there were very, very many gains over those 20 years, and that the money, some of the money did go somewhere. And that seems to be lost in the recrimination over the way it ended. So when we're talking about now being in the post-US era, how do we move to the post-Taliban 2.0 era? It seems entrenched, and people like to pull figures, oh, there'll be 5 years of this, or if it lasts 10 years. How does it end when it is so entrenched and there is the tolerance? You named a number of countries before. I think there's about a dozen or 2 dozen ambassadors there, countries that do want to do some level of business. And the Americans, there's always rumors about whether they're flying a balloon themselves. I don't know about whether or not they're going to reopen the embassy in Kabul. How are we going to be moving towards the post-Taliban era, do you think?
I think your point about there being a perception in Europe, the US, and North America, Australia, other parts of the world that it's been a failure, that there's been no gains, is not just a failure of these countries to show their people what they've enabled in Afghanistan by their blood and treasure, but it's also, in my view, a long-term failure of the governments in Afghanistan, but also of the people of Afghanistan, because we collectively have failed to speak in a way that I think communicates this massive achievement that we collectively had in Afghanistan. I think part of that is that it's hard to communicate that, because when you speak English in London to a cab driver, it is taken for granted that you'd be speaking English in London as a person from Afghanistan. But the fact that this person is not just literate, which is massive in Afghanistan, literacy rate was very, very low, but that is literate in a second language and is able to take a cab in London, all of those things represent achievements, but those things are very easy to take for granted and very hard to communicate. So that's that. But I think, to come to your question, the Taliban, I mean, unless in economics, they have this jargonistic term called an exogenous shock. A system will continue to be that system unless an exogenous shock displaces something and causes a chain reaction that would alter the fundamentals. I think the Taliban we had that concept of decline and fall. I think the Taliban will continue to remain in power unless the fundamentals change, unless there's an exogenous shock. And by exogenous, I don't mean that it has to come through the bombs and B-52s of the United States, but an exogenous shock could come from outside of the Taliban group themselves. It could be a domestic opposition group that is able to overturn the tide of the Taliban dominance. Because unless that happens, the Taliban, in my view, are able to stay and continue. Their rule may be challenged in certain parts of the world, parts of the country. They may lose control of it in certain places. They might become corrupt in certain places. They might have political disagreements amongst themselves, and those are hallmarks and systems of all political systems. You become corrupt and decay, and you disagree, and at certain times those disagreements become public. So that, I think, is our worst fear. But there are groups inside of Afghanistan who are at the forefront of the resistance. The women being one of them, the armed opposition groups being another. But also you have in Afghanistan a diaspora now that is highly educated, highly global, but also highly connected with Afghanistan. And I think that's an asset that if the US is listening and paying attention, if the UK is listening and paying attention, if Australia and Canada and Germany are listening and paying attention, I think is an asset that could be that exogenous shock that, together with what is happening in Afghanistan and leveraging the diaspora, I think there are opportunities to work with that, but also to work with the international system, the UN Security Council resolutions that are putting sanctions on the Taliban. I think those sanctions themselves have been eroded because not only have there been so many waivers and exemptions for the Taliban for those sanctions to be ineffective, but also that there are these shady gray area travel by the Taliban, such as the Haqqanis travel to the UAE and then to Saudi Arabia, even though they are under the UN Security Council sanctions and there were no waivers, that you're seeing an erosion of the international UN Security Council mandate, resolution sanctions. And so you can tighten the screws that way. You can tighten the screws through diplomatic measures, but also by enabling and supporting the people of Afghanistan to take their own destiny in their own hands, because the only way Afghanistan is going to have sustainable peace is if all the people of Afghanistan have a say in what their future looks like. And at this moment, under the Taliban, they do not have a say about what their future looks like, not least because the Taliban have been imposed on them by the barrel of a gun.
True, very true, everything you say, but also the oxygen in the room is being sucked out by the old guard and the persistently corrupt, if I may say, who seem to be getting a lot of financial support to get together and talk about going back, retaking power. There doesn't seem to be any effort to involve new voices, younger voices, patriotic voices, who may have ideas and come up with a plan for the future of Afghanistan that does not include the old warlords, the old figures in government, old cabinet ministers, if I may say. I get into a lot of trouble for saying and writing about this, but I don't believe that there is any effort or any substantial meaningful effort by people who say that they are supporters of Afghanistan to involve people of your generation, people like you, people like people who were incredibly involved at the political, social and cultural levels in Afghanistan before the collapse. And so I'm wondering, is there a way, is there an alternative to what's being done? There's the Vienna Convention, which is, you know, the UN and the old guard. There's the other get-togethers where everybody comes in. Ismail Khan appeared at the last one. It's like, really, how do you get people, right-minded, like-minded people together, those who have an interest in an inclusive democratic future for Afghanistan, and get them together in a way that creates a meaningful roadmap for the future?
Look, I think that you use the term warlords, although I think in a context devoid of political connotations, warlord is descriptive of a certain person with a certain background. But I think in Afghanistan, warlord, the term warlord is used in a particular political context, and I think in that political context is that when you label somebody a warlord, it's almost as if you are trying to portray your political opposition in a certain light. And I think if there's a better term for us to use to describe the same people with the same background, checkered, bad, terrible background, I would prefer to use that. I don't know what other term we could use, but I think, but I just wanted to point that out. But the reason why the old guard, if you will, old cabinet ministers, former politicians, people who had been involved in the jihad in the past, continue to be relevant, even now that they're living abroad, I think speaks to a certain level of inertia in the international community, because each country had its own political uh, representatives, its own political contacts, and they want to stay in touch with those political contacts. And it's hard to build a new legacy contact with the new generation who are now just coming up and emerging. And in the eyes of these international players, they haven't proven themselves. And so there's a certain systemic inertia that is maintaining the relevance of these old guard, if you will. And the same way that they've been talking about the Taliban being a reality of the Afghan society, the old guard is a reality of the Afghan political landscape and society. And certain number of these old guard have some popular support, but and so I think while there is a need for a new generation to rise up, a generation untainted by the sins of their forefathers, I think the way to do that is for the global community to sort of recognize and reach out and build bridges, establish alliances with them, because it's not that the new generation leaders are not forming groups; they are. It's not that they're not organizing initiatives; they are. The one thing that is lacking is that these emerging leaders and their initiatives and their work is not recognized at the political level by the countries in which they're living. And I think once that connection is established, I think you'll see that it could be leveraged to great effect. And you will see the rise of a new generation of leaders in Afghanistan who are not just better educated, but also more able to build bridges with each other and are socialized politically with a different worldview, which is an Afghanistan that is cosmopolitan, that is connected with the world, that is not afraid of actually being bound by the rules of the global order, which is human rights treaties, conventions, trade, and things like that. And I think you cannot say the same thing of the old guard, who is maintaining their relevance by virtue of the inertia of the political systems in which they live in the context that they've nurtured over the last 4 or 5 decades.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you so much for your time, Shuja. Before we go, I understand you're working on your next book. Can you tell us what it's about?
I cannot tell you what the next book is about, but I know that I'm working on it. But I can tell you a book chapter that I'm working on. And the book chapter is about recognition. And the book chapter talks about the normalization and diplomatic relationships with the Taliban that the global community is doing. And the book chapter argues that even though no country has stepped up and said, we formally recognize the Taliban, that these de facto acts of establishing diplomatic relations has the legal effect of recognizing the Taliban regime. And recognition in Afghanistan is not about recognizing the Afghan state, because the Afghan state, as expressed by the Afghan passport that is being recognized by the world, is recognized. It is really the recognition of the Taliban regime as the Afghan government. So it's really the legitimacy and the legitimacy of the power of the Taliban that is tied to international recognition. And in that book chapter explores those themes.
Tacit recognition, which is what the Taliban is thriving on. Thank you again so much for your time, and I wish you the best of luck with both the chapter and the book.
Thanks for having me, Lynn.
That was Ahmad Shuja, scholar, lawyer, human rights advocate, author, former official in the fallen government of Afghanistan. He talked about the post-US era in Afghanistan, how the country moves to a post-Taliban 2.0 era, and the effectiveness or otherwise of jargon when it comes to raising and holding global attention for the atrocities being committed against Afghanistan's people. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. That's it for now. I'm Lynn O'Donnell. Bye-bye.